The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown street as people hurried to their destinations. Coffee shops were filling with the usual crowd of office workers and students. Among them, a small brown dog with patches of white on its chest wandered nervously between the outdoor cafe tables. The dog looked lost and scared. Its ribs were visible through its thin coat, and its eyes darted around searching for something or someone. A few kind strangers had tried to approach it, but the frightened animal would back away, tail tucked low between its legs. Near the corner of 5th Street, a group of bikers had parked their motorcycles. The loud rumble of their engines had died down, but their presence still commanded attention. Most people gave them a wide berth, crossing to the other side of the street or finding alternative routes to avoid any potential trouble. The leader of the group was a massive man named Rick. His arms were covered in tattoos, and his leather vest displayed patches from various motorcycle clubs. He had a reputation in the area for being unpredictable and aggressive. His gang respected him out of fear more than loyalty. As the small dog wandered closer to where the bikers were standing, Rick noticed it sniffing around near their bikes. The animal was probably just looking for food scraps or water, but Rick saw it differently. "Get that mud away from my bike," Rick growled to his companions. The dog, sensing the hostile tone, tried to move away quickly, but accidentally knocked over an empty beer bottle that had been left on the ground. The sound of breaking glass made Rick's face turn red with anger. He stepped forward, his heavy boots making threatening sounds on the pavement. The dog cowered, pressing itself against a nearby wall with nowhere to escape. "You think you can mess with my stuff?" Rick shouted at the terrified animal. Several pedestrians stopped to watch, but none dared to intervene. Rick's reputation preceded him, and people knew better than to get involved in his business. The dog whimpered softly, its whole body shaking. It tried to make itself as small as possible, hoping the angry man would leave it alone. But Rick was just getting started. He picked up another empty bottle and threw it near the dog, making it jump and yelp. The sound echoed off the buildings, and more people began to notice the commotion. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others quickly walked away, not wanting to witness what was about to happen. "Please stop," called out an elderly woman from across the street. Her voice was shaky, and she clutched her purse tightly. "It's just a poor dog. It doesn't mean any harm." Rick turned his attention to her for a moment, his eyes cold and menacing. "Mind your own business, lady, unless you want to be next." The woman quickly looked down and hurried away, fear evident in her quick steps. This only emboldened Rick further. He enjoyed the power he held over people, the way they scattered when he showed his true nature. Turning back to the dog, Rick cracked his knuckles loudly. The animal was pressed so tightly against the wall that it seemed to be trying to disappear into the brick itself. Its brown eyes were wide with terror, and small whining sounds escaped from its throat. "Maybe this will teach you to stay away from things that don't belong to you," Rick said, raising his hand threateningly. The dog flinched, expecting the blow to come. But then something unexpected happened. A small child, probably no more than 6 years old, broke away from her mother's grasp and ran toward the scene. "Don't hurt the doggy," the little girl cried out, her voice clear and brave despite her size. She positioned herself between Rick and the cowering animal, her small arms spread wide as if she could shield it from harm. The crowd gasped. The child's mother screamed and started running toward her daughter, panic evident in every step. But she was too far away to reach her in time. Rick looked down at the little girl with surprise and growing irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a child. His gang members shifted uncomfortably behind him, unsure of what their leader would do next. "Get out of here, kid," Rick said through gritted teeth. "This isn't your problem." But the little girl didn't move. She stood her ground, her chin raised, defiantly. "My daddy says only bad people hurt animals. Are you a bad person?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rick's face grew even redder, and his hands clenched into fists. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see how this dangerous situation would unfold. Rick had never backed down from a confrontation in his life. His reputation was built on fear and intimidation. But now, faced with this tiny defender and a growing crowd of witnesses, He found himself in an impossible position. The dog, sensing the child's protection, managed to move slightly closer to its young guardian. It was still trembling, but something in the girl's brave stance seemed to give it a small amount of courage. Rick took a step closer to the child, his shadow falling over her small frame. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. People in the crowd began pulling out their phones, some to call for help, others to record what might happen next. The little girl's mother was still running toward them, tears streaming down her face as she called out her daughter's name. But she was still several yards away, and time seemed to be moving in slow motion. Rick raised his hand again, this time directed at both the child and the dog. His gang members watched nervously, knowing that their leader had crossed lines before, but never in such a public setting with so many witnesses. Just as Rick was about to make his move, the sound of another motorcycle engine cut through the tension. Unlike the rough, loud rumble of the gang's bikes, this one had a smooth, powerful purr that spoke of quality and precision. All eyes turned to see who was approaching, and the atmosphere began to shift in ways that no one could have predicted. A sleek black motorcycle pulled up to the curb with the grace of a predator. The rider wore a perfectly fitted leather jacket and dark sunglasses. Even with his helmet still on, there was something commanding about his presence. The bike came to a stop with barely a whisper, in stark contrast to the loud, aggressive machines belonging to Rick's gang. The newcomer removed his helmet slowly, revealing a face that many in the crowd immediately recognized. It was Jason, a man known throughout the city not for causing trouble but for stopping it. His reputation was the complete opposite of Rick's. Where Rick ruled through fear, Jason commanded respect through quiet strength and unwavering principle. Jason's appearance was like a circuit breaker in an electrical overload. The tension that had been building to a dangerous peak suddenly found a new focal point. People in the crowd began to whisper excitedly, pointing and nudging each other. Some quickly grabbed their phones, but this time to capture the arrival of someone they actually wanted to see. Rick's gang members shifted nervously behind their leader. They had heard stories about Jason, though they had never encountered him directly. The stories painted a picture of a man who didn't start fights but always finished them. More importantly, he was known for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Jason dismounted his bike with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in the cowering dog, the brave little girl still standing guard, and the menacing figure of Rick looming over them both. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that suggested a storm brewing beneath the surface. The little girl turned to look at the newcomer, her face lighting up with hope. She had heard the adults talking about Jason before, always in tones of admiration and respect. Even at her young age, she sensed that help had arrived. Jason walked toward the confrontation with measured steps. He didn't hurry, didn't show any signs of aggression or fear. His confidence was the kind that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of and being comfortable with that knowledge. "Morning," Jason said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. It wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. There was something about his tone that demanded attention without demanding anything at all. Rick turned to face this new arrival, his posture still aggressive, but now uncertain. He had built his reputation on being the biggest, meanest presence in any room. But Jason's quiet confidence was something entirely different, something Rick didn't know how to handle. "This doesn't concern you," Rick said, trying to maintain his commanding tone. But there was a slight tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. The crowd noticed it, and so did his own gang members. Jason continued his approach, stopping just outside what most people would consider a safe distance from Rick. Up close, the difference between the two men became even more apparent. Rick was larger and more muscular, his body displaying the kind of bulk that came from years of intimidation tactics. Jason was leaner, but moved with the precision of someone who had trained extensively in combat disciplines. "Actually," Jason said, his voice still conversational, "I think it does concern me. See, I have a problem with people who pick on those who can't defend themselves." The dog, still pressed against the wall, let out a soft whine. Jason glanced down at the animal and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. The little girl caught this change and took a small step closer to Jason, instinctively recognizing an ally. Rick's face flushed even redder. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not in front of his own crew and a growing crowd of onlookers. His reputation depended on maintaining the fear and respect of others. If he backed down now, word would spread quickly throughout the area. "Look, pretty boy," Rick snarled. "You better get back on your fancy bike and ride away before you get hurt. This is between me and this mutt." Jason's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. It was subtle, like the moment before lightning strikes when the hair on your arm stands up. The crowd sensed it. The dog sensed it. And even Rick's gang members took an unconscious step backward. "The dog belongs to me," Jason said simply. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. Everyone stared at Jason in surprise, including Rick. The claim was unexpected and changed everything about the situation. If the dog belonged to Jason, then Rick wasn't just threatening a stray animal anymore. He was threatening someone's property, someone's companion. Rick's mouth opened and closed a few times as he processed this new information. His gang members looked confused, unsure of how this development affected their position. The crowd began, murmuring among themselves, trying to understand this twist in the confrontation. The little girl looked up at Jason with wide eyes, then down at the dog. The connection between man and animal wasn't obvious to her young mind, but she was willing to accept it if it meant the dog would be safe. "You're lying," Rick said finally, though he sounded less certain than before. "That's just some street mutt. It doesn't belong to anybody." Jason reached into his jacket pocket slowly, making sure his movements were visible to everyone watching. He pulled out what appeared to be a small leather collar with a metal tag attached. The sunlight caught the tag, making it flash briefly. "Luna," Jason said, looking directly at the dog. "Come here, girl." What happened next surprised everyone, including Jason himself. The dog's ears perked up at the name and its tail gave a tentative wag. Slowly, carefully, the animal began to move away from the wall. It was still frightened, still trembling, but something in Jason's voice had reached it. The crowd watched in amazement as the dog took hesitant steps toward Jason. It paused several times, looking back at Rick with fear, but Jason's calm presence seemed to be stronger than the terror the biker had instilled. When the dog finally reached Jason's side, he knelt down slowly and gently fastened the collar around its neck. The animal pressed against his leg, seeking comfort and protection. Jason's hand rested lightly on its head, a gesture of both possession and guardianship. Rick stared at this development with growing confusion and anger. His carefully planned intimidation had been completely derailed by this stranger's unexpected claim. But more than that, he was beginning to realize that he had chosen the wrong target for his aggression. The little girl clapped her hands together softly, delighted that the dog now had someone to protect it. Her mother finally reached the scene and quickly pulled her daughter back to safety, but not before the child gave Jason a brilliant smile of gratitude. Jason stood up slowly, the dog remaining close to his side. He looked at Rick with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the encounter, but now there was something else there. A quiet warning that spoke louder than any threat could have. Rick's gang members were beginning to show signs of serious discomfort. What had started as their leader asserting dominance over a defenseless animal had transformed into something much more complicated. They exchanged glances, silently communicating, their growing unease about the situation. The crowd had grown larger as word spread about the confrontation. People emerged from nearby shops and cafes, drawn by the drama unfolding on the street. Many recognized Jason and felt a sense of relief that someone with his reputation for justice had arrived. Others simply sensed that they were witnessing something significant. Rick tried to regain control of the situation by taking a more aggressive stance. He puffed out his chest and took a step closer to Jason, using his size advantage to try to intimidate the smaller man. In Rick's experience, most people backed down when faced with his imposing physical presence. "I don't care if that mutt belongs to you or not," Rick declared loudly, making sure his voice carried to the watching crowd. It damaged my property, and somebody's going to pay for it. Jason glanced down at the broken beer bottle that had started this whole confrontation. The pieces of brown glass scattered on the pavement looked insignificant compared to the drama they had unleashed. He looked back up at Rick with an expression that might have been amusement if it weren't for the steel behind his eyes. Your property, Jason repeated slowly. You mean the empty beer bottle that was left on public property? The question hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of Rick's claim. Several people in the crowd began to chuckle quietly, recognizing the ridiculousness of threatening a dog over littered trash. Rick's face grew even redder as he realized how foolish his justification sounded when stated so plainly. Luna, the dog, had begun to relax slightly under Jason's protective presence. She was still wary of Rick and his gang, but the trembling in her legs had subsided. Jason's hand remained gently on her head, a constant reassurance that she was no longer alone and vulnerable. One of Rick's gang members, a younger man with nervous energy, whispered something urgent in his leader's ear. Rick brushed him away irritably, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The smart play would be to find a way to back down without losing face, but Rick's pride wouldn't allow him to consider retreat. Jason seemed to sense the internal struggle playing out in front of him. He had dealt with bullies before and understood the psychology that drove them. They were dangerous when cornered, but they also had predictable weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with patience and skill. Tell you what, Jason said conversationally. Why don't I pay for your bottle? Would $5 cover it? The offer was made with such casual sincerity that it caught Rick completely off guard. He had expected continued confrontation, perhaps threats or challenges to fight. Instead, Jason was offering to resolve the situation with simple compensation, treating the entire conflict as a minor misunderstanding between reasonable people. This approach completely undermined Rick's position. If he accepted the money, he would look petty and small, threatening a dog over pocket change. If he refused, he would appear unreasonable and aggressive, especially with so many witnesses present. Jason had created a lose-lose scenario for the bully with nothing more than polite courtesy. Rick's gang was watching this masterclass in conflict de-escalation with growing respect for Jason's tactical skills. Several of them were beginning to understand why their leader's usual intimidation tactics were failing so completely. Jason wasn't playing by the same rules that governed most street confrontations. The crowd was also recognizing the brilliance of Jason's approach. By treating Rick's complaint as legitimate while simultaneously highlighting its trivial nature, he had exposed the bully's behavior without directly attacking him. It was a form of social aikido, using Rick's own aggression against him. But Rick was too proud and too invested in maintaining his tough image to recognize the elegant exit Jason had provided. Instead of accepting the face-saving offer, he doubled down on his aggressive stance. I don't want your money, Rick snarled. I want respect. That dog disrespected me, and so did you by interfering. Jason's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The patient courtesy remained, but there was something harder underneath it now. He had offered Rick a way out, a chance to end this confrontation without anyone getting hurt. The fact that Rick had rejected this olive branch meant that the situation would have to be resolved differently. Luna seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. She pressed closer to Jason's leg, seeking comfort from the tension that was building again. The little girl who had first tried to protect the dog watched from her mother's arms, her eyes wide with concern. I see, Jason said quietly. So this isn't really about property damage. This is about respect. Rick nodded vigorously, thinking he had finally gotten through to this interfering stranger. That's right. Nobody disrespects me in my own neighborhood. Nobody. Jason looked around at the crowd of onlookers, then back at Rick. Your neighborhood, he repeated thoughtfully. How long have you lived here, Rick? The use of his name startled Rick. He hadn't introduced himself, which meant Jason had recognized him or had been asking around about local troublemakers. Either possibility suggested that Jason's involvement wasn't as random as it had first appeared. Long enough, Rick replied defensively. Longer than you, I bet. Jason nodded slowly, as if considering this information carefully. "You know, Rick, I've been coming through this area for about 3 years now, and in that time I've heard a lot of stories about you." The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that the conversation was about to take another significant turn. Rick's gang members looked increasingly uncomfortable, realizing that their leader might have picked a fight with someone who knew more about them than they had initially assumed. "I've heard about the shop owners you've intimidated for protection. Money," Jason continued in the same conversational tone. "I've heard about the families who cross the street when they see you coming. I've heard about the local kids who are afraid to play in the park when your gang is around." Each statement hit Rick like a physical blow. These weren't accusations made in anger or heat, but simple observations delivered with the weight of undeniable truth. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, recognizing the accuracy of Jason's words from their own experiences. Rick's carefully constructed image as a neighborhood tough guy was being systematically dismantled in front of everyone who mattered to him. His reputation, built on fear and intimidation, was being exposed as the hollow edifice it truly was. "But you know what I haven't heard, Rick?" Jason asked, his voice still maddeningly calm. "I haven't heard a single story about you standing up for anyone else. I haven't heard about you protecting the weak or helping those in need. All I hear are stories about a bully who picks on those who can't fight back." The words struck Rick like lightning, each syllable cutting through his carefully constructed facade. Around him, the crowd was nodding in agreement, their faces showing recognition of the truth in Jason's assessment. Years of accumulated resentment toward Rick and his gang seemed to surface all at once. An elderly shop owner, who had been watching from the doorway of his store, stepped forward slightly. "He's right," the man said, his voice shaky but determined. "Rick has been collecting money from my store for 2 years. Says it's for protection, but protection from what? From him and his friends." This testimony opened floodgates. Other voices from the crowd began to speak up, sharing their own experiences with Rick's intimidation tactics. A young mother talked about how her children were afraid to walk to school when the gang was around. A teenage boy mentioned how Rick had taken his bicycle just because he could. Rick's face had gone from red to pale as he realized how many people in his own neighborhood actually felt about him. The fear he thought he commanded had been masking deep-seated hatred and resentment. His gang members were looking increasingly uncomfortable, some of them taking subtle steps away from their leader. Jason remained silent during these testimonies, allowing the community to speak for itself. Luna stayed close to his side, no longer trembling but still alert to the tension in the air. The dog seemed to understand that her protector was more than capable of handling the situation. "That's enough," Rick shouted, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I don't have to listen to this garbage from a bunch of sheep." But his words fell flat. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and everyone present could feel it. Rick was no longer the intimidating figure who had terrorized the neighborhood for years. He was just a man whose bluff had been called in the most public way possible. Jason stepped forward slightly, his movement causing Rick to instinctively take a step back. It was a small gesture, but everyone noticed it. The feared neighborhood bully had just retreated from someone half his size. "Here's what's going to happen, Rick," Jason said, his voice still calm but now carrying unmistakable authority. "You're going to apologize to Luna here for frightening her. Then you're going to apologize to that brave little girl who stood up for her. And then you and your friends are going to get on your bikes and leave." Rick's mouth opened to protest, but Jason held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," Jason continued. "After today, if I hear about you bothering anyone in this neighborhood, anyone at all, I'm going to take a very personal interest in your activities. Do you understand me?" The threat was delivered without raising his voice, without aggressive posturing, without any of the theatrical intimidation that Rick relied on. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who had the ability and willingness to follow through. Rick looked around desperately, seeking support from his gang members. But what he saw in their faces wasn't the loyalty and fear he expected. Instead, he saw doubt, embarrassment, and in some cases, barely concealed relief that someone had finally stood up to him. One of the younger gang members, the same one who had tried to whisper warnings earlier, stepped forward. "Rick, maybe we should just go," This has gotten out of hand. Rick whirled on him with fury. Are you telling me what to do now? After everything I've done for this crew? What have you done for us, Rick? The young man asked, his voice gaining strength. All you've done is make enemies. Half the city hates us because of your behavior. We can't go anywhere without people looking at us like we're criminals. This mutiny from within his own ranks was the final straw for Rick's crumbling authority. Other gang members began nodding in agreement, their long-suppressed frustrations with their leader's methods finally finding voice. Jason watched this internal collapse with interest but didn't interfere. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully was to give them enough rope to hang themselves. Rick was doing an excellent job of destroying his own credibility without any help. The crowd was also watching this drama unfold with fascination. Many of them had never seen Rick challenged so directly, and certainly not by his own people. The man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just minutes ago was rapidly losing control of everything that mattered to him. Luna chose that moment to do something unexpected. She walked slowly toward Rick, no longer showing the fear she had displayed earlier. When she reached him, she sat down and looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes. The gesture was simple, but profound. The dog that Rick had terrorized was now showing him more dignity and courage than he had shown anyone else in years. Several people in the crowd murmured appreciatively at the animal's brave display. Rick looked down at Luna with confusion. He had expected continued cowering and fear. Instead, the dog was demonstrating the kind of quiet strength that he himself had never possessed. It was a lesson in courage that shamed him more than any words could have. Jason watched this interaction with approval. Luna's trying to tell you something, Rick. She's showing you what real strength looks like. It's not about making others afraid of you. It's about facing your fears and doing what's right even when it's difficult. The little girl who had first protected Luna broke free from her mother's grasp once more and walked over to stand beside the dog. Together, the child and the animal looked up at Rick with expressions free of hatred or revenge. They simply waited to see what he would choose to do. Rick found himself facing a moment of truth. He could continue down the path of aggression and intimidation, but it was clear that road led nowhere but isolation and eventual defeat. Or he could take the harder path of admitting his mistakes and trying to become something better. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see which choice he would make. Jason remained ready to act if Rick chose violence, but his posture suggested he was hoping for a different outcome. For a long moment, Rick stood frozen between his old patterns and the possibility of change. The weight of years of bad decisions pressed down on him, but so did the hope that it might not be too late to choose differently. The silence stretched out, filled with possibility and tension in equal measure. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Rick's internal struggle was visible on his face, as decades of learned behavior warred with a glimmer of something that might have been conscience. The crowd watched, with bated breath, sensing they were witnessing a pivotal moment that could change everything. Finally, Rick's shoulders sagged slightly. The aggressive posture that had defined him for so long began to crumble, revealing something smaller and more vulnerable underneath. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, looking down at Luna. The words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. "I shouldn't have scared you." Luna's tail gave a small wag as if accepting the apology. The little girl smiled and reached out to gently pat the dog's head. The simple gesture of forgiveness from both child and animal seemed to unlock something in Rick that had been buried for years. He turned to the little girl next, kneeling down to bring himself to her eye level. Up close, she could see that his eyes were watery, though whether from emotion or just the strain of the confrontation was unclear. "You were very brave," Rick told her quietly. "Braver than I was. I'm sorry I scared you and your dog friend." The child studied his face seriously for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "It's okay. My mommy says everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is to say sorry and try to be better." Her innocent wisdom hit Rick harder than any of Jason's calculated moves had. Here was this tiny person offering him forgiveness and guidance with the pure heart that only children possess. It made his years of intimidation and cruelty seem even more pathetic by comparison. Standing up slowly, Rick faced the crowd that had gathered to witness his downfall. These were his neighbors, people he had terrorized and exploited for years. Looking at their faces, he could see the years of accumulated pain and resentment his actions had caused. "I owe all of you an apology too," he said, his voice growing, stronger as he continued. "I've been a bully and a coward, picking on people who couldn't fight back. That stops today." Some members of the crowd looked skeptical, and Rick couldn't blame them. After years of fear and intimidation, words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild trust. He would have to prove his change through actions over time. One of his gang members, the young man who had first questioned his leadership, stepped forward. "Rick, what does this mean for the crew?" Rick looked at his followers, really seeing them for perhaps the first time in years. Most of them were young men who had joined his gang seeking belonging and protection. Instead, he had led them down a path that made them outcasts and targets for law enforcement. "It means we stop being parasites," Rick said firmly. "No more protection rackets. No more intimidating shop owners. No more terrorizing families. If you want to stay with me, we find legitimate work. If not, you're free to go with no hard feelings." Several of the gang members exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about this dramatic change in leadership philosophy. A few looked relieved, as if they had been waiting for permission to leave the criminal lifestyle behind. Others appeared skeptical, wondering if this transformation could possibly be genuine. Jason had remained silent throughout Rick's apologies, but now he stepped forward. Luna moved with him, still staying close to her protector's side. The dog seemed more relaxed now, sensing that the immediate threat had passed. "Words are a good start, Rick," Jason said neutrally. "But the people in this neighborhood have heard promises before. What they need to see are actions that prove you mean what you say." Rick nodded, understanding the challenge. "What would you suggest?" Jason gestured toward the elderly shop owner who had first spoken up about the protection. "Money. Maybe start by returning what you've taken. And not just from him, but from everyone you've been squeezing." The suggestion hit Rick's finances hard, but he recognized the justice in it. "That's going to take some time. I don't have all that cash on hand anymore." "Then you'll have to work for it," Jason replied simply. "Get a legitimate job. Pay people back bit by bit. Show them you're serious about making amends." Rick's pride bristled at the thought of ordinary work after years of easy money from intimidation. But looking around at the faces of his neighbors, he realized that his old life had bought him nothing but isolation and hatred. Perhaps honest work would be a better investment in his future. The elderly shop owner stepped forward hesitantly. "Rick, if you're serious about changing, I could use help with inventory and stocking at my store. It's not glamorous work, but it pays fairly." The offer stunned Rick. After years of extorting money from this man, he was being offered legitimate employment. It was an act of faith that Rick wasn't sure he deserved, but it represented the possibility of redemption. "I'll take it," Rick said quickly, before he could second-guess the decision. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Other members of the community began stepping forward with their own offers. A woman who ran a small restaurant mentioned needing help with deliveries. A man who owned a construction company said he could use experienced hands for upcoming projects. Rick's gang members watched in amazement as their former victims transformed into potential employers and allies. The power of genuine repentance and community forgiveness was something none of them had ever witnessed before. Jason observed these developments with quiet satisfaction. This was the outcome he had hoped for when he first intervened. Violence would have resolved the immediate situation, but it wouldn't have addressed the underlying problems that had created the conflict in the first place. Luna seemed to sense that her ordeal was truly over. She walked back to Jason's side and sat down, her tail wagging properly for the first time that day. The transformation from terrified stray to confident companion was remarkable to witness. The little girl who had been Luna's first protector ran over to Jason and tugged on his jacket. When he knelt down, she whispered something in his ear that made him smile genuinely for the first time during the entire confrontation. "She wants to know if Luna would like a treat," Jason announced to the crowd. "She has some cookies in her backpack that she was saving for lunch." The offer of sharing food was the ultimate gesture of friendship from a child. Luna approached the little girl cautiously, then gently accepted the offered cookie. The sight of the former victim and her young defender sharing this moment of peace brought smiles to faces throughout the gathered crowd. 3 months later, the same street corner looked completely different, though nothing physical had really changed. The same shops lined the sidewalk, the same cafe tables sat outside under colorful umbrellas, and the same flow of pedestrians moved through the area, going about their daily business. But the atmosphere was transformed. Rick could be seen through the window of the elderly shop owner's store, carefully arranging merchandise on shelves. His leather jacket had been replaced with a simple work shirt, and his aggressive demeanor had given way to focused concentration on his tasks. The transformation wasn't just in his appearance. When customers entered the store, Rick greeted them politely, helped them find what they needed, and even smiled occasionally. The elderly shop owner, whose name was Mr. Chen, had become something of a father figure to Rick. At first, their relationship had been tense and awkward. Rick struggled with taking orders from someone he had once intimidated, and Mr. Chen had to overcome years of justified fear and resentment. But gradually, mutual respect had developed. "You're getting better at this," Mr. Chen said one afternoon, as Rick finished setting up a new display. "The customers are starting to trust you. Mrs. Patterson even asked for you specifically yesterday." Rick felt a warmth in his chest that was unfamiliar but welcome. For years, the only recognition he had received was based on fear. Having someone appreciate his work and effort was a completely different experience, one that he found surprisingly addictive. Outside the store, the neighborhood had indeed changed. Children played in the small park across the street without their parents hovering nervously nearby. Shop owners kept their doors open longer, no longer worried about unwanted visitors demanding protection money. The community was healing from years of intimidation. Several of Rick's former gang members had followed his example, though not all of them. 3 had found legitimate work in the area, including the young man who had first questioned Rick's leadership. He was now working for the construction company and had discovered a talent for carpentry that surprised everyone, including himself. 2 other members had chosen to leave the area entirely, unwilling to give up the criminal lifestyle, but smart enough to recognize that their old territory was no longer welcoming to that behavior. Rick had let them go without argument, understanding that change had to be chosen, not forced. Jason had become a regular presence in the neighborhood, though in a much quieter way than his dramatic first appearance. He could often be seen having coffee at the outdoor cafe, reading a newspaper, or simply watching the world go by. Luna was always with him, now wearing a proper collar with tags and looking healthy and well cared for. The little girl who had first stood up to Rick had become something of a local celebrity among the adults, though she seemed largely unaware of her fame. She had made friends with Luna and would often stop to pet the dog and chat with Jason when she passed by on her way to and from school. On this particular afternoon, she approached Jason's usual table with excitement written all over her face. She was carrying a small wrapped package and bouncing slightly on her toes with anticipation. "Mr. Jason," she said, using the formal address her parents had taught her, "I made something for Luna." Jason smiled and gestured for her to sit down. "What did you make?" The little girl carefully unwrapped her package to reveal a hand-knitted sweater in bright blue yarn. It was clearly the work of small hands with uneven stitches and slightly crooked seams, but it was made with obvious love and care. "My grandma taught me how to knit," she explained proudly. "I thought Luna might get cold when winter comes." Jason examined the sweater with the seriousness it deserved. "This is beautiful work. I think Luna will love it. Would you like to help me put it on her?" Together, they gently worked the sweater onto the patient dog. Luna seemed to understand the significance of the gift and stood still while they adjusted the fit. When they were finished, she wagged her tail and licked the little girl's hand in thanks. From across the street, Rick watched this scene through the store window. The sight of the child who had once protected Luna from his anger, now showering the dog with kindness, filled him with complex emotions. Pride in the community's healing, shame for his past actions, and hope for continued redemption all mixed together. Mr. Chen joined him at the window, following his gaze. "That little girl has a good heart," the older man observed. "She reminds us all what courage really looks like." Rick nodded silently. The child's bravery in standing up to him had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Without her intervention, the confrontation might have ended very differently, and the opportunity for change might never have presented itself. As the afternoon wore on, other familiar faces appeared in the scene. The young mother who had spoken up about her children's fears now let them play freely while she chatted with other parents. The teenage boy whose bicycle Rick had once stolen rode by on a new bike, waving cheerfully to Jason as he passed. The elderly shop owners and restaurant workers who had been forced to pay protection money now operated their businesses with confidence and optimism. Sales had actually improved since the intimidation ended, as customers felt more comfortable shopping and dining in the area. As closing time approached, Rick finished his final tasks for the day. Mr. Chen reviewed his work with approval and handed him his daily wages. The money was honestly earned, and though it was less than what Rick had once extorted from businesses, it felt far more valuable. "Same time tomorrow?" Mr. Chen asked, as he did every day. "Yes, sir," Rick replied, as he did every day. The routine had become comforting rather than restrictive. Having a purpose and a place where he was valued had given his life a structure it had never possessed before. As Rick prepared to leave, he noticed Jason and Luna approaching the store. The dog was still wearing her new blue sweater and looked extremely pleased with herself. Jason carried a small bag from the bakery down the street. "Good evening, Rick," Jason said pleasantly. "How was work today?" "Good," Rick replied, still sometimes surprised by the casual friendliness in Jason's tone. "Mr. Chen says I'm getting the hang of inventory management." Jason nodded approvingly. "That's excellent. I actually wanted to talk to you about something. The community center is starting a program to help at-risk youth, and they're looking for people who understand what it's like to make bad choices and find a way back. Would you be interested in volunteering?" The suggestion caught Rick off guard. The idea of being trusted to help guide young people seemed almost impossible given his history. But then he remembered his own gang members, some of whom had been barely more than children when they started following him down the wrong path. "You really think I could help?" Rick asked uncertainly. "I think you have experience that could be valuable," Jason replied. "Not everyone gets a second chance like you did. Maybe you could help make sure more people get that opportunity." Rick looked back through the store window at Mr. Chen, who was counting the day's receipts with satisfaction. Then he looked at Luna, contentedly wearing her gift from a child who had once stood between her and danger. Finally, he looked at Jason, the man who had offered him a path to redemption when he could have simply provided punishment. "I'd like to try," Rick said finally. "I owe this community a lot more than just paying back money. Maybe this could be a start." Jason smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Rick. I think you're going to do great things." As they shook hands, Luna barked once in what sounded like approval. The little girl's voice could be heard in the distance, calling goodbye to her friends as she headed home for dinner. The ordinary sounds of a peaceful neighborhood evening surrounded them, a symphony of community life that had been restored through courage, forgiveness, and the possibility of change. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.